Let's stay with this particular story now and speak to Kristal Duncan-William, Youth Capital Project Lead. Thank you so much for your time. The number of unemployment persons in the country going up in the second quarter, your reaction firstly?
I think we've seen continuous increases overall in unemployment in the last decade. And, 1% this way, another percentage that way. It doesn't detract from the fact that as a trend over time, our unemployment rate has increased exponentially in the last decade. Clearly, the interventions that have been put in place are not working to address the crisis. And at the end of the day, the majority of those left at the back of the queue in terms of jobs are young people, particularly young Black women.
And where would you say the loopholes are?
Firstly, the approaches to youth unemployment have often been this idea that there's some magical solution, one single solution. If we just fix education, if we just get young people more equipped with soft skills, somehow all of our problems will go away. But unfortunately, this is a really complex problem. We need to look at the supply side. So yes, equipping young people with 21st century workplace skills, ensuring that NSFAS functions so that young people can pursue these studies, providing young people with a first work experience through public employment programs. These are key, but we also need to grow the economy. And before I was on, I know you had a segment talking to this economic growth and how, economists are feeling positive that we will see some kind of uptick. Unfortunately, that uptick is going to be marginal, and we have to ensure that growth in the economy leads to jobs. Sometimes you get jobless growth, and that's also not what we want. So we need to be looking at both the supply and demand side. And as a country, we haven't done enough holistically on both fronts to address the crisis.
And are we exploring the informal sector enough in your view?
We don't think so at Youth Capital. We think it's a vastly untapped resource. We are an anomaly on the continent. Most of our neighbors across the continent have much larger informal sectors than we have in South Africa. There is a history of overly burdensome and cumbersome restrictions placed on informal traders, and so the hoops that people have to go through to trade informally are often too high for people to jump through. In the informal sector is really seen as something survivalist. People go into it when they literally have no other choice and are therefore often just doomed to fail. They have zero capital to invest and are just one event away from, the business collapsing. And so the informal sector needs more support. Young people in particular need more support, not just financial to start a business, but with skills and mentorship. Many young people have never worked. Many young people don't have post-school qualifications. And so to expect them to set up a thriving business is a leap too far. We need to think about ways to support young people to step into self-employment, and then we need to look at existing tax incentives and look at how we can change the regulations or the application processes so that more small and medium businesses can apply for these.
And I suppose, there are real risks here, because the longer young people are unemployed, the more they're seen as a risk, especially, for potential employers, for example. And this is a huge one in terms of a risk going into the future.
Not only are employers viewing them as riskier, so the longer they're unemployed, the less likely they are to be employed, but also the mental health state of young people. Imagine being unemployed for over a year, 2 years, 3 years. Some people say they've been looking for 5 years without finding work. What that does to one's mental health, the pressure you feel from your family, knowing that you're just sitting at home, trying your best to apply for work when you have the money to do so, and yet you can't find a job. So we also see the mental health burden places on young people. And we as a country are losing out on the skills, the energy, and the potential of, a generation of young people who just cannot get a foot into the labor market or keep their grip on opportunities when they do find them.
And I'd like to go back to something that you touched on a little earlier on, and that is around, the concern around women. I mean, the SABC, for example, noting that, South African women continue to shoulder a disproportionate burden of unemployment, underemployment, as well as lower workforce participation compared to men. And, we've been hearing about this over time now, and especially when you even think about the COVID-19 pandemic and what it also did there as well. And there are some, of course, of the other factors that women are having to deal with here. What needs to change?
We, in our latest research mailer, unpacked some of the complexities there, given that it's Women's Month. and care work falls unfairly onto the shoulders of women. We know that far more women partake in unpaid care work than men, and this prevents women from taking part in income generating work. And so what we see is that young women in particular are left with a choice to look after children, to look after elderly family members, to look after other siblings, while this burden falls less on the shoulders of men. And so it becomes really difficult for young women to make these choices when the cost of a daycare for your child, or the cost of a carer for your elderly parent, is more than what your job is going to bring in, and it becomes kind of pointless to then go to work when these responsibilities are shouldered by you. We also know that many young women, when they do fall pregnant, find it really difficult to go back into the work with issues around, breastfeeding or having the money for childcare, as I've said. So we need to find ways where we can create a more inclusive workplace for young women in particular, and what sort of social protections through the grant system can allow for women to become more active in income generating work, as opposed to the unpaid care work that is, invisible to many in the economy.
Inclusivity, as you say, is quite critical. So let's see then, and some really compelling arguments that you make there when it comes to really resolving this particular crisis. Thank you so much for your time, Kristal. Appreciate it. That was Kristal Duncan-William, Youth Capital Project Lead.